My name is Clara. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 2 years, I've been running my late grandmother's bookstore. At my mother's 60th birthday party, in front of all our friends and family, my parents handed me a real estate agent's business card and told me it was time I sold the shop, gave the money to my brother, and left their lives for good. The bookstore wasn't just my job, it was my home, the only thing I had left of my grandmother. What they didn't know was that in a dusty old safe, my grandmother had left behind a final will that was about to give me everything. If you've ever felt like the disposable child in your own family, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Before I tell you how this one piece of paper changed everything, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength when you're pushed to the edge. My life, before it was turned upside down, was defined by the scent of old paper, worn leather, and brewing coffee. I managed the Story Nook, a small, charmingly cluttered bookstore that had been in our family for 50 years. It wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary that had been my grandmother Eleanor's passion project, and after she passed away 2 years ago, it became mine. I hadn't planned it this way. I had a degree in graphic design and a promising junior position at a fast-paced firm in the city, a life I was proud of building brick by brick. But when Grandma Eleanor's health started to fail, I moved back home without a second thought, trading my sleek, modern apartment for the cozy, slightly slanted one above the shop. After she was gone, the thought of putting a for sale sign in the window felt like a physical betrayal. So, I stayed, determined to keep her legacy alive. The problem was, I was the only one who saw it as a legacy. To my parents, Richard and Susan, and my older brother Mark, it was just a piece of real estate in a prime downtown location, an underperforming asset taking up valuable space. This was the fundamental, unspoken dynamic of our family. I was the sentimental caretaker, the quiet anchor, and Mark was the brilliant, high-flying investment. Mark, at 32, was a serial entrepreneur, a master of the pitch deck and the buzzword. He'd had a dozen next big things: a gourmet food truck specializing in fusion tacos that failed its health inspection, a line of artisanal soaps that gave people rashes, and a crypto trading app that was, in his words, too ahead of its time. Each failed venture was funded by my parents, who would drain their savings, take out small loans, and praise his relentless ambition while he racked up personal and professional debt. Meanwhile, I was the responsible one, which was family code for the one they never had to worry about, and therefore never had to truly support. The pattern was set so early, it was woven into the fabric of my childhood. When I was in my first year of art school, struggling to make ends meet, Mark decided to launch his first real company. He needed a logo, a website, a full branding package. My parents called me. "Clara, honey," my mother had said, her voice full of excitement. "Mark needs your help. It would be such a wonderful way for you to contribute to the family's future." I spent 3 weeks of my semester break working tirelessly, using the skills I was paying thousands to learn, to create a professional-grade brand identity for him. I didn't charge him a penny. He sold the company 6 months later for a small profit, never once acknowledging my contribution. That profit funded a trip to Europe for him and his girlfriend. This pattern of injustice was a constant, low hum in the background of my life. Last year, the bookstore's ancient heating system finally gave out in the middle of a brutal January. The repair cost was nearly $5,000. I asked my parents if they could help, reminding them that the store was technically still a family asset. My father sighed, launching into a lecture about profit margins and poor business management. "We just can't, Clara," he said, his tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "Mark needs a new laptop for his new venture, and we have to support his career. It's an essential tool." I ended up draining my personal savings, the money I'd carefully put away from my design career, to keep the pipes from bursting and the few loyal customers from freezing. 2 weeks later, I saw pictures of Mark on social media, holding up his top-of-the-line MacBook Pro at a trendy coffee shop in another city, captioning it, closing deals on the road. Entrepreneur life. It wasn't a business trip. It was a weekend getaway with his girlfriend. I'd pour my heart into creating community events at the store, story times for kids, author signings, a book club for seniors, only to have my mother comment during our weekly phone call. "That's nice, dear. Did you hear Mark is networking with venture capitalists?" They lived in the large family home a few miles away, while I lived in my grandmother's old apartment, surrounded by her books and memories. They rarely visited, but they often called with requests. "Clara, can you look after the house while we visit Mark for the weekend?" "Clara, Mark needs some professional-looking graphics for his new pitch deck. Can you whip something up? You're so good at that stuff." I always said yes, clinging to the fading hope that one day my contributions would finally be seen and valued. I loved my family, and I kept believing that if I were just a little more helpful, a little more successful in my own quiet way, they would eventually see me. I thought I could handle their constant disregard, but I had no idea that my grandmother's passing had already set in motion a storm that would tear our broken family apart for good. Grandma Eleanor's death was the single most painful event of my life. She was more than a grandmother to me. She was my mentor, my confidant, my biggest cheerleader, and the only person in my family who saw me for who I was, not what I could do for them. While my parents were focused on Mark's flashy ambitions, she was the one who celebrated my art, encouraged my creativity, and saw the quiet strength in me. Her passing left a void that I knew would never be filled. An aching silence in the rooms where her laughter used to echo. For my parents and brother, however, their grief seemed to be quickly overshadowed by a sense of opportunity. The day after the funeral, the four of us sat in my grandmother's lawyer's office for the reading of the will. The office was stuffy, smelling of leather and old paper, and the air was thick with a strange mix of feigned solemnity and barely concealed anticipation. Mark was fidgeting with his expensive watch, tapping a restless rhythm on the arm of his chair. My mother kept dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk tissue, a performance of sorrow that felt hollow. The lawyer, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Henderson, who had known my grandmother for decades and had seen me grow up, read from the document in a somber tone. It was straightforward, exactly as I had expected. My grandmother's house and her modest savings were to be split equally between my parents and Mark. The bookstore, which he described as being heavily in debt and operating at a loss, was left to me. I felt a surge of both profound gratitude and immense responsibility. She had entrusted me with her life's work, the heart of her world. It was the greatest honor she could have given me. My family's reaction was quite different. "That's it?" Mark blurted out, unable to hide his raw disappointment. "I thought she had more tucked away. She always lived so frugally." My father quickly shushed him, shooting him a look, but the sentiment hung in the air, ugly and exposed. My mother, in that moment, added her own subtle jab. "Well, Mark, she probably knew you had bigger things ahead of you and wouldn't be tied down by a little shop." They saw the house as their prize, a significant asset they could now leverage. They saw the bookstore as my burden, a financial albatross. "Well, Clara," my mother said, patting my hand with a look of theatrical pity, "at least you'll have a place to live, for now. Don't worry, we'll help you figure out how to sell it. It's probably for the best to get out from under all that debt." Her words were meant to sound comforting, but they were laced with a condescension that made my skin crawl. In their minds, the matter was settled. The real inheritance had been distributed, and my piece was a sentimental trinket with a lot of associated problems. They had no idea how much of my own work and personal sacrifice it took just to keep the lights on. The store wasn't just underperforming. It was a financial black hole that I was single-handedly trying to fill. They had conveniently forgotten that my grandmother had taken out a second mortgage on the property years ago to help my dad through a tough business period. That debt hadn't magically disappeared. It was now mine. This event, the reading of this first superficial will, became the catalyst. It solidified their view of the new family hierarchy. They had the valuable asset. I had the failing one. This perceived imbalance emboldened them. giving them a sense of righteous authority over me. Their subtle, lifelong disregard for my efforts transformed into open, unapologetic condescension. Mark started referring to me as his bohemian sister living her quaint little life, while he was out making real moves in the world. My parents began talking about their plans for the money from selling my grandmother's house as if it were a done deal, discussing renovations for their own home and, of course, the ever-present seed money for Mark's next guaranteed success. They saw the inheritance not as a final gift from a loved one, but as fuel for the family's engine, an engine that was, and always had been, built entirely around my brother. The stage was set for a conflict, and every single action they took from that day forward just pushed us closer to the inevitable breaking point. In the months that followed, life became a series of escalating aggressions, each one a calculated slight designed to chip away at my resolve and remind me of my place. The family's sense of entitlement, now supercharged by their inheritance, was on full, unapologetic display. My bookstore, and my life within it, became their personal resource pool, a backdrop for their whims and a bank for their demands. The first incident was small, almost laughable in its audacity. Mark swaggered into the shop one afternoon with a date, clearly wanting to show off his family's charming little business. He proceeded to pull a rare, first edition copy of The Great Gatsby off the shelf, one I had carefully sourced for a loyal collector, and handle it with greasy fingers from his lunch, while trying to impress the girl with his supposed literary knowledge. When I gently asked him to be careful, he scoffed loudly. "Relax, Clara. It's just a book. I'll probably own this whole place one day anyway. Might as well get used to it." He then graciously offered his date a coffee and a pastry from my cafe counter, winked at me, and walked out without paying. It was only about $10, but the message was a thunderclap. This was his territory, and I was just the unpaid help. The second incident was more serious and cut deeper. Mark's latest venture was a luxury lifestyle brand which, as far as I could tell, involved him trying to become a social media influencer by posting photos of himself in expensive locations. He called me in a full-blown panic one evening. "I need $2,000, Clara. Right now. No questions asked." He explained he'd hired a photographer for a big shoot to build his portfolio and had forgotten his wallet. "Just take it from the store's account," he said, his voice casual, as if asking for a piece of gum. "You can make it back in a few days, right? It's for the family's future." I refused, explaining that the store was barely making payroll and that I couldn't afford to cover his irresponsibility. The rage in his voice was immediate and venomous. "Are you kidding me? It's family. What is wrong with you? You're hoarding that money for yourself." He hung up. An hour later, as expected, my father called. "Your brother is trying to build a future, Clara. What's a couple of $1,000s to support that? You're being incredibly selfish. Don't you want to see your brother succeed? Your grandmother would be so disappointed in your lack of family loyalty." I held my ground, but the weight of their coordinated guilt-tripping was immense and exhausting. The third and most invasive incident came a month later and felt like a true violation. I came downstairs from my apartment one morning to open the shop and found my mother in the middle of the main floor, directing two men who were moving shelves. She had decided, without a single word to me, that the children's section, my most profitable and beloved corner of the store, was cluttered and old-fashioned. She was replacing my cozy, mismatched armchairs with a sleek, cold metal bench and installing garish, modern shelving that clashed violently with the store's historic character. "It needs a refresh, sweetie," she said, waving a dismissive hand when she saw the look of horror on my face. "Mark thinks the place looks dated. This will attract a more upscale clientele." I stood there, speechless, a key in my hand to a place that no longer felt like my own. She was redecorating my home, my business, based on the whims of my brother who hadn't read a book since high school. When I tried to protest, her voice became sharp. "Clara, this is a family asset. We're the majority stakeholders in this family, and you have to listen to us. Stop being so sentimental, it's just stuff." I tried to have a calm, rational conversation with them that evening. I invited them over, made dinner, and laid out my feelings as gently as I could. "I feel like my role here isn't being respected," I began. "This store is my responsibility, my home. I need to be able to make my own decisions." My father leaned back, crossing his arms, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "You're being overly emotional, Clara. We're just trying to help you. You should be grateful we care enough to get involved." My mother added the final twist of the knife. "Honestly, we're worried about you. You've hidden yourself away in this dusty old place since Grandma died. It's not healthy. Mark is out there living life, and you're here, surrounded by ghosts." They twisted my dedication into a character flaw, my sacrifice into a sign of weakness and mental instability. The validation I so desperately needed came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Gable, a loyal customer who had been my grandmother's best friend, stopped by a few days after my mother's disastrous redecoration. She looked at the sterile new bench with a sad, knowing smile. "Your grandmother loved that old floral armchair," she said quietly. "She said it was the best place in the world to read a story to a child. It held a lot of magic." She then took my hand, her eyes full of a fierce concern that cut through my fog of self-doubt. "Dear, I hope you know how much you're valued, even if your own family is too blind to see it. Your grandmother always said you were the one with the steel spine, even if you didn't know it yet. What you're doing here, keeping this place alive, it's a beautiful, brave thing. Don't you let them take that from you." Her words were a lifeline. It wasn't me. I wasn't being oversensitive or emotional. The situation was as unfair and toxic as I felt it was. Her kindness solidified a thought that had been quietly growing in my mind. I couldn't keep living like this, but I never could have predicted the brutal, public way they would force my hand. The breaking point didn't come with a whisper. It came with a toast, a round of applause, and a sickeningly sweet smile. The event was my mother's 60th birthday party, a grand affair held at my parents' house. They had invited everyone, extended family, old friends, neighbors, anyone who could serve as an audience for their family's curated image of success. It was supposed to be a celebration, but for me, it felt like I was knowingly walking into the lion's den, dressed as the main course. I had spent the week leading up to it working tirelessly, caught in the same old trap of trying to earn their affection. I baked my mother's favorite cake from scratch, a complicated, multi-layered lemon and raspberry confection, and found a thoughtful, personalized gift. A rare, signed first edition book by her favorite author that I'd tracked down through a network of collectors. I arrived feeling a familiar, nauseating mix of hope and dread hope that perhaps, on this special occasion, they would offer a moment of genuine appreciation, and dread that I would once again be an invisible footnote in the Mark show. For the first hour, things were predictably tense. The house was decorated to the nines, a perfect picture of suburban success. My parents praised Mark loudly for his amazing gift, an expensive, framed glamour shot of himself, which he claimed was an heirloom for future generations. My carefully chosen, deeply personal gift was met with a polite, distracted, "Oh, that's nice, Clara," before being set aside on a table, already forgotten. Mark monopolized every conversation, talking about his brand, his followers, his imminent success, dropping buzzwords like synergy and disruption into every sentence. I stood by, smiling, playing the part of the supportive daughter and sister, a role I had perfected over a lifetime. Then, after everyone had eaten my cake, my father tapped his glass for a toast. A hush fell over the room. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate my beautiful wife, Susan," he began, his voice booming with practiced charisma. "As we enter this new chapter of our lives, we've been thinking a lot about the future, about legacy, and about ensuring our children have the best possible opportunities to succeed." He paused, looking directly at Mark, with a smile of pure, unadulterated pride. Then his eyes shifted to me. His expression was no longer warm. It was businesslike, cold, and dismissive. "Which brings us to an announcement," my mother chimed in, taking my father's hand as if they were on a stage. "As you all know, our son Mark is on the verge of a major breakthrough with his company. He has an incredible opportunity, but it requires a significant capital investment to take it to the next level." I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach, cold and hard. I knew where this was going, but the public nature of it was a fresh new cruelty. "And Clara," my father continued, his voice resonating through the silent, watching room, "has been so wonderfully dedicated to her grandmother's old bookstore. But we all agree it's time for a change. It's time for her to start her own life, and it's time for that property to finally be put to good use for the whole family." My mother walked over to me, a brilliant, false smile plastered on her face. In her hand wasn't a piece of cake, but a small, crisp rectangle. She pressed it into my palm. My skin recoiled from the touch. It was a business card for a commercial real estate agent. "We've already spoken to him," she said, her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "He thinks he can get a quick, very profitable sale. The money will be more than enough for Mark's investment." She then leaned in, wrapping her arm around my shoulders in a mockery of a hug, and whispered in my ear, her voice like ice. "This is your contribution, Clara. Your gift to the family. Sell the store, give the money to your brother, and find your own way. It's time you left for good." The room was a blur of faces. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, some pitiful, some curious, some deeply uncomfortable. The sound in the room seemed to fade to a dull roar. They had just publicly declared me a failure. They had framed my life's work as a mere obstacle to my brother's success. They had disowned me, packaged it as a birthday announcement, and demanded I hand over my home and my livelihood as a parting gift. In that moment, something inside me didn't just break, it vaporized. The years of quiet hope, of trying to earn their love, of believing in the hollow idea of our family, it all vanished. I looked at their smiling, expectant faces and saw them for what they were. Users who had mistaken my kindness for weakness, my loyalty for stupidity. I felt nothing but a cold, clear, liberating certainty. This was over. I wasn't just going to leave, I was going to fight back. And I suddenly remembered a conversation with my grandmother, a small iron key she had given me, and a solemn promise about protecting her true legacy. They had just made the biggest, most spectacular mistake of their lives. I left the party without another word. The real estate agent's card, a toxic piece of cardboard in my clenched fist. The drive back to the bookstore was a blur of righteous, white-hot anger. Their cruelty hadn't crushed me. It had forged me into something sharp and unyielding. As I walked into the quiet, dark shop, the familiar smell of old books and dried ink felt like a comforting embrace, a reminder of what was real. This was my grandmother's legacy, my home, and they were not going to take it from me. My mind flashed back with perfect clarity to a conversation I'd had with Grandma Eleanor about a week before she died. She had been frail, tucked into her favorite armchair, but her mind was as keen as ever. She'd pulled me close, her hand surprisingly strong as she pressed a small, ornate iron key into my palm. "This is for the old safe in my office," she'd whispered, her voice thin but urgent. "The one behind the portrait of your grandfather." The will Henderson read was the one everyone expected. It was a decoy. "But what's in this safe, Clara? This is the truth. Don't open it unless you absolutely have to. But if they ever try to take this place from you, you use it to protect what's ours." At the time, I'd dismissed it as the rambling of a sick, perhaps confused woman. Now, her words echoed with a chilling, brilliant prescience. I walked into the small back office, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm. I took down the heavy, gilded portrait of my grandfather, his stern gaze seeming to offer a nod of approval. Behind it, just as she'd said, was a small black wall safe, covered in a thin layer of dust. The iron key slid into the lock, and turned with a satisfying metallic click that sounded like destiny. Inside, there was a single, thick, manila envelope. My hands, surprisingly, were steady as I opened it. There were 2 documents inside. The first was a legally binding last will and testament, dated just 1 month before her death, properly signed and witnessed by 2 of her oldest friends, including Mrs. Gable, and stamped with a notary's seal. The second was a multi-page, handwritten letter, the familiar loops of her cursive filling the page, addressed to me. I read the will first. It was simple, devastating, and utterly brilliant. It began by revoking all previous wills. It then stated, in clear, unflinching legal language, that due to her son Richard and his wife Susan's demonstrated financial irresponsibility and long-standing pattern of emotional neglect, they were to receive nothing from her estate. It continued, stating that due to her grandson Mark's reckless and parasitic nature, and his utter lack of character, he was also to receive nothing. The family home they were currently living in, which my grandmother had secretly retained full ownership of, it was to be sold immediately, with all proceeds going into a trust, and the entirety of her estate, the bookstore and its property, the trust from the sale of the house, and her entire investment portfolio, which I now saw was worth nearly $2 million that she'd kept hidden from her spendthrift children, was left, solely and entirely, to me, her granddaughter, Clara Eleanor. My legs gave out, and I sank into the chair. The documents spread before me. They thought they were inheriting a house. They had no idea they were about to be evicted from it. Then, I picked up the letter. It was my grandmother's voice on the page, warm, loving, and fiercely protective. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and they have finally shown their true colors. I am so sorry, my love, that I have left you to face this, but I knew you were the only one strong enough. I have seen the way you have been treated, my quiet, steadfast girl. For years, I have watched your parents enable your brother and ignore you. I have watched them drain their finances for his foolish dreams, while you built a life of substance and integrity. I gave them so many chances. The money I lent your father to start his business, the down payment for their house, it was all met with entitlement, never gratitude. They believe my wealth is their birthright. They are wrong. A legacy is not about money. It is about values. This bookstore is not a business, Clara. It is a legacy of love, of stories, of community. You are the only one who understands that. This inheritance is not a reward. It is a tool. It is your shield and your freedom. Use it to protect this place. Use it to build a life so beautiful and full that their small-minded greed can never touch you. Do not let them make you feel guilty for a single moment. You have earned this, not through blood, but through character, through love, and through sacrifice. Be brave, my girl. They have underestimated you your entire life. Let this be the last time. All my love, Grandma Eleanor. Tears streamed down my face, tears of grief for her loss, of gratitude for her love, and of an overwhelming sense of validation that felt like the sun breaking through a storm. I wasn't just fighting for a building. I was fulfilling my grandmother's final, brilliant wish. The next morning, my course of action was crystal clear. I found the business card for the lawyer mentioned in the will, a Mr. David Sterling. I called his office, my voice devoid of any of its previous hesitation. Mr. Sterling, I said. My name is Clara. I'm Eleanor's granddaughter. I believe you have been expecting my call. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then a warm, professional voice replied, Miss Clara, yes, I have. Your grandmother was a remarkable and very thorough woman. When would you like to meet and set the world right? The plan was in motion. I scheduled the meeting for 2 days later. The location was non-negotiable. The bookstore, my territory, my fortress. I called my parents. My voice a calm, level instrument they had never heard before. I told them that I had spoken with the real estate agent and that we needed to have a final family meeting with a lawyer present to discuss the terms of the sale and the legal transfer of funds. The greed in my mother's voice was a palpable thing over the phone. "Of course, dear. That's so responsible of you. We'll be there." "Is the lawyer yours or ours?" "He's the family's estate lawyer," I replied, which was technically, beautifully, true. They arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, Mark trailing behind them, already talking on his phone about the specs of the sports car he was going to buy. They walked in with an air of arrogant ownership, looking around the store not as a place of literary charm, but as a collection of assets to be liquidated. Mark casually knocked a stack of books off a table and didn't bother to pick them up. I had asked Mrs. Gable to be present as a neutral witness, a nod to her friendship with my grandmother and her role as a signatory on the final will. She sat quietly in the children's corner armchair, a silent, powerful pillar of support. Seated behind my grandmother's old oak desk was Mr. Sterling, a distinguished man in his late 50s with kind eyes and the unshakable resolve of a seasoned lawyer. I introduced him simply as Mr. Sterling, the estate lawyer who will be overseeing the transition. "All right, let's get this over with," my father said impatiently, taking a seat and tapping his fingers on the desk. "The agent said he can have this place listed by Monday. We want a quick sale, no messing around. Cash offer preferred." "We've already decided the split," Mark chimed in, leaning against a bookshelf as if he owned it. "I get 70% for the business investment, and you guys can have 30% for, being parents." My mother beamed at his supposed generosity, while my father nodded in stern agreement. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, a soft sound that commanded immediate attention. The room fell silent. "I believe there has been a significant, and I must say profound misunderstanding," he began, opening a leather-bound portfolio with deliberate slowness. "We are not here today to discuss the sale of this bookstore. We are here to execute the final and legally binding last will and testament of Eleanor." My father's face clouded with confusion. "What are you talking about? The will was read weeks ago. Henderson handled it." "He handled the previous will," Mr. Sterling corrected him gently, his voice precise. "A will which your mother created a new one to supersede, just 1 month before her passing. As the executor of this final will, it is my duty to inform you of its contents." The color drained from my parents' faces. Mark stopped smirking, his posture straightening. "What new will?" my mother whispered. Mr. Sterling calmly and methodically read the document aloud. He started with the clauses revoking all previous wills. Then he read the parts explicitly disinheriting Richard, Susan, and Mark, his voice unwavering as he detailed the reasons Eleanor had provided. Long-standing financial irresponsibility, a pattern of emotional neglect, and a parasitic nature utterly devoid of character. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. Mark's jaw was hanging open. "This is insane! It's a forgery!" my father sputtered, jumping to his feet and pointing a trembling finger at me. "She was sick. She was senile. Clara manipulated her. We'll fight this." "On the contrary," Mr. Sterling said, his voice as firm as granite. "Eleanor was certified by 2 independent physicians as being of perfectly sound mind when she signed this document, a copy of which is in this portfolio. She was very clear and very determined about her wishes. And Mrs. Gable, present here today, was one of the witnesses." He then delivered the final, devastating blows, reading the clauses that bequeathed the entire estate, the bookstore, the $2 million investment portfolio, and the proceeds from the mandatory sale of their current home solely to me. The room erupted into chaos. "She's taking our house! Our home!" my mother shrieked, her voice cracking. "That's my money! Our money! She can't do this!" Mark started yelling, his face turning a blotchy red as he lunged towards me before being stopped by a stern look from Mr. Sterling. He called me a thief, a snake, his words laced with profanities. I let the storm of their entitlement rage for a moment, and then I stood up, holding the handwritten letter from my grandmother. "She knew you would react this way," I said, my voice cutting through the noise with a quiet authority that stunned them into silence. "And she wanted you to hear why she did it, in her own words." My hand was steady as I read the letter aloud. I read the parts about their entitlement, about their blindness to my loyalty, about their constant exploitation. With every word, their rage deflated, replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. The letter was not just a legal explanation. It was a moral judgment from beyond the grave, delivered by the woman they had claimed to love and respect. When I finished, there was a heavy, suffocating silence. My mother was sobbing quietly, not with grief, but with the shock of being truly seen. My father had sunk into his chair, looking 10 years older, the bluster completely gone. Mark just stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. "The bookstore is not for sale," I said, my voice filled with a strength I never knew I possessed. "And this is no longer just my business. It's my home. According to the will, you have 90 days to vacate my grandmother's, now my house. Mr. Sterling will handle all the details of the sale and your departure." I looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes without flinching. "At the party, you told me to leave forever. So I am. I'm leaving behind the dysfunctional, toxic family that you were. And I'm starting a new one, here, with the legacy my grandmother entrusted to me." I turned to my parents. "The party is over." Watching them file out of the bookstore was an out-of-body experience. The blustering anger, the shrieking accusations, all of it was gone, replaced by a dazed, defeated silence. They moved like ghosts, their faces pale with shock. They didn't look at me as they left. It was as if acknowledging my presence, seeing the quiet strength in my eyes, would make their new, diminished reality too real to bear. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, the silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was full of light, of air, of possibility. Mrs. Gable walked over and gave me a long, warm hug, her embrace feeling as solid and real as my grandmother's used to. "She would be so proud of you, Clara," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. So proud." That day marked the beginning of my true independence. It was a line drawn in the sand. The first thing I did was close the store for a week. I put a sign on the door that said, "Closed for renovations and a rebirth." For 7 days, I didn't just clean out the physical clutter. I purged the lingering energy of their negativity. I dismantled my mother's soulless modern shelves with a crowbar, a deeply satisfying act of reclamation. I hunted down vintage armchairs at flea markets to restore the cozy, magical children's corner. I repainted the walls in a warm, welcoming cream color that made the whole space feel brighter. With Mr. Sterling's help, I accessed the initial funds from my grandmother's estate. The first act was purely symbolic, but it felt monumental. I wrote a check and paid off the store's crushing debt in a single transaction. The weight that lifted off my shoulders was palpable. I could finally breathe. I hired a part-time assistant, a bright young literature student named Sarah. I ordered new, exciting inventory from independent publishers. I started planning a grand reopening event that would celebrate the store's history and its vibrant future. The apartment upstairs, which had always felt like a temporary perch, finally started to feel like a real home. I bought a ridiculously comfortable new bed, hung my own art on the walls, and filled the space with plants and light. I was no longer a guest in my own life. My family's immediate aftermath was a predictable spiral. They went through the 5 stages of grief, but for their lost inheritance. First was denial, with my father calling Mr. Sterling daily, threatening baseless legal challenges. Mr. Sterling, a bastion of calm professionalism, calmly informed him that any contest would be fruitless, legally inadvisable, and would only rack up legal fees that would ultimately be deducted from the estate before the house sale. Then came anger. manifesting in a string of vitriolic voicemails on my phone, which I saved for legal purposes but did not answer. Then came the bargaining, with my mother leaving tearful, manipulative messages. "Clara, please, we can work this out. We'll let you keep the store, just don't take the house. Think of your family." But the reality of their situation began to set in with brutal swiftness. Without my grandmother's financial safety net, and with the impending non-negotiable loss of their home, they were forced to confront the consequences of their choices for the first time in their lives. Mark's luxury lifestyle brand collapsed within a month without the constant infusion of their cash. He had to sell his sports car and, after weeks of fruitless searching for another investor, get a real job, an entry-level sales position at a car dealership that he complained about constantly and bitterly. They were adrift, and the person who had always been their silent, unappreciated anchor was now charting her own course, far out at sea. I felt a fleeting pang of sadness for the family we could have been, but it was quickly overshadowed by a profound, life-altering sense of relief. 10 months after that fateful confrontation, my life was unrecognizable in the most beautiful way. The grand reopening of the Story Nook had been a huge success, far exceeding my wildest dreams. The local newspaper did a feature story on the bookstore's revival, not just as a business, but as a community cornerstone. They painted me as a young entrepreneur preserving a piece of the town's history, a narrative that felt both humbling and incredibly empowering. The place was thriving. I had started a monthly open mic night for local poets, a partnership with a local animal shelter for Read to a Puppy events that was wildly popular, and the children's corner was always full of laughter and wide-eyed wonder. I wasn't just making a living. I was curating a space for connection and making a difference. The store had become the community hub my grandmother had always dreamed it would be. The financial freedom she had given me was life-changing. I hired a full-time store manager, a retired librarian with a passion for books, which allowed me to finally go back to my own passion. I set up a freelance graphic design business, working from my sunny apartment above the shop. I was now able to be selective, choosing clients and projects that inspired me, not just ones that paid the bills. I had found a way to merge my two worlds, honoring my grandmother's legacy while building a vibrant future of my own design. I even started a scholarship fund in my grandmother's name at the local high school for students pursuing the arts, a way to pay her legacy forward. As for my family, their world had shrunk as mine had expanded. They had to sell the large family house and downsize to a small, rented condo on the outskirts of town. The transition was a brutal shock to their system. My mother, who had built her entire social standing around her beautiful home and her son's supposed success, became withdrawn and isolated. I heard from a cousin that she rarely went out anymore. My father, stripped of his role as the family patriarch and benefactor to his golden child, seemed lost and diminished. Mark's situation was the most dramatic. After getting fired from the car dealership for his poor attitude and for trying to run a side hustle from his desk, he had to move back in with my parents. The three of them were crammed into a 2-bedroom condo. The tension, I heard, was palpable. The arguments were constant, with my parents blaming Mark for their downfall and Mark blaming them for not preparing him for the real world. The brilliant investment had defaulted, and the returns were bitter recriminations and resentment. About 6 months in, my mother called, her voice hesitant and small. "Clara, we were wondering if maybe we could come for a visit to the store." I agreed, but I set clear boundaries. It would be a short visit during public hours. When they arrived, they were different, humbled. They looked around at the bustling, successful store with a mixture of awe and deep, unspoken regret. "You've done a wonderful job, Clara," my father mumbled, looking at a display of bestsellers I had curated. Mark said nothing, just stared at the humming espresso machine and the busy cash register, perhaps calculating the sales he believed should have been his. There was no grand apology, but there was a quiet, painful acknowledgement of their new reality and my undeniable success. Before they left, my mother pulled me aside. "Your brother, he's having a hard time. He needs a root canal and he has no insurance. It was the old script, the familiar appeal, but this time, I was different. I looked at her calmly and said, "I'm sorry to hear that. I hope he can find a clinic with a payment plan." The next day, I had Mr. Sterling anonymously send a voucher to a local dental clinic to cover the cost of the procedure, paid for from the estate trust. It was an act of compassion, not obligation. It was a way of showing them the person my grandmother raised me to be, without letting them pull me back into their toxic cycle of dependency. My help now came with a healthy, impenetrable boundary. I would not let them sink, but I would no longer be their lifeboat. They had to learn to swim on their own. Looking back on the last year, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing a family member can leave you isn't money or property, but the tools to find your own strength and the freedom to use them. My grandmother's real gift wasn't the $2 million. It was the permission to finally, unapologetically, put myself first. It was the ultimate validation that my quiet, steady dedication was infinitely more valuable than my brother's loud, empty ambition. For years, I believed that family was an unconditional obligation. I thought that meant I had to endure the disrespect, absorb the injustice, and keep giving pieces of myself away until there was nothing left. But I was wrong. True family doesn't diminish you. It builds you up. It doesn't see your kindness as a resource to be exploited. It sees it as a quality to be cherished and reciprocated. My real family turned out to be the community I built within these four walls. The loyal customers who became friends. The aspiring authors who shared their dreams. The children discovering the magic of reading for the first time. It was Mrs. Gable, who now volunteers to read stories on Saturdays, and Sarah, my assistant, who shares my passion for books. That is the family I choose. My relationship with my parents and brother is distant now, and maybe it always will be. But for the first time in my life, it's finally honest. They see me now, not as the dutiful, invisible daughter, but as the woman who holds the legacy they so carelessly threw away. And in truly seeing me, they are forced to see themselves. That, I believe, is the truest and most lasting form of justice. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own well-being from a toxic family expectation? I would love to hear your stories and your strength in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to hear more real-life stories about overcoming challenges, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that their worth is not defined by those who refuse to see it. Thank you for listening, and may you always have the courage to be the main character in your own story.